morning from Washington, D.C., and good afternoon to our viewers in Kiev, Ukraine. My name is Melinda Herring, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council in Washington. It's really a pleasure to bring together three great experts to discuss President Zelensky's recent visit to Washington. I am joined by Ambassador John Herbst, who's the director of our Eurasia Center. I'm joined by Alexander Sandy Vershbaugh, a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council's Scrowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, and finally by Dr. Hannah Shellis, Director of Security Studies at the Foreign Policy Council Ukrainian PRISM. We wanted to bring together a mix of American and Ukrainian experts to discuss the visit. So we haven't been together in a while, so here's how we're going to do this. We're going to have a conversation with our three experts. I invite you to get on Twitter. I invite you to post those questions in the Zoom link. We want to make this discussion interactive. I'm going to kick things off, and then I'm going to turn to you, our audience, to ask questions to specific experts. So let's get started. I'd like to ask all three of you a very basic question. What was the purpose of the visit? Ambassador Herbst, I'm going to turn to you first, please.
Thank you. The purpose of the visit was to, I would say, put on a secure footing the relationship between Ukraine and the United States after a particularly difficult couple of years, or a little bit more than a couple of years, going back to the effort by then President Trump to politicize the relationship and put pressure on Zelenskyy to participate in American politics. That was a very strange event, which fortunately Trump backed down from. But Zelenskyy had wanted to have a White House meeting with Trump after he was elected, and it didn't happen because Trump was playing games. And then, of course, when Biden came in, everyone was pleased this would establish a new relationship. But there, too, there was a problem because Biden's peculiar and I would say disastrous decision to waive sanctions on Nord Stream 2, which itself then became an obstacle to arranging a suitable time for the visit. All of these things, again, meant the United States' relationship with Ukraine needed to be put back on a solid footing. You also had the catastrophic withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan, an intelligent strategic decision, but handled in a completely incompetent way, which called into question America's reliability as an ally. I think that question was a little bit overstated, but here too, it was important for Ukraine to hear positive things from the President of the United States. And looked against this rather difficult backdrop, the meeting was, to my mind, a great success. Biden provided the reassurances Ukraine needed to hear, and not just Ukraine, but American allies around the world. Biden reminded us that he, in fact, is greatly experienced in foreign policy and largely knows what he's doing. And it was good for not just for America's friends, but for America's foes, especially Moscow, to hear that the United States had Ukraine's back. So the specific achievements of this visit, beyond the assurances, the general assurances from Biden, were to renew our framework agreement on security, to look more closely, to do the same in the energy area, and to look more closely at concrete defense cooperation. The details are very important. They've not been worked out, and that will be the next stage in the relationship.
Great. Thank you, Ambassador Herbst. Hannah, any other purposes you saw for the visit?
Definitely turn the page from the Trump era scandals. That is one of the top issues that is coming to mind, and that's what Ambassador Herbst perfectly described. But I also would say that this visit was important from the domestic point of view for Ukrainian president. As almost 2 years passed since his election, or no, even 2 years, and in the opposition, let's be honest, there have been certain, not accusations, but certain statements that, look, he couldn't secure a meeting, that the United States maybe is not accepting his way of reforms, or that the latest scandals with the corporate governance, with anti-corruption, that because of these, till the very last moment, a lot of journalists have been asking, maybe this visit again would be postponed. So, except of all those foreign policy issues, security issues that Ambassador Herbst just described, I would also add the domestic Ukrainian context, why this visit was so important for President Zelenskyy to demonstrate his achievements and the value of the US Ukrainian relations for Ukrainians in particular, and definitely the Russian factor. Here, Moscow is definitely, it's not the elephant in the room, but it is the certain context that's been creating, especially after the agreement between the United States and Germany, that brought certain doubts, let's say, the reasonable doubts in minds of a lot of politicians in Ukraine and in Moscow. And with this visit, it seems to me that these doubts more or less being dispersed.
Thanks a lot, Hannah. Sandy, did these guys miss anything?
I don't think they missed very much. I was going to use very similar words to John in terms of shoring up the foundation of the relationship, getting it back on a secure footing, and showing that the two leaders developing a rapport with each other. I think they both had an interest in reinforcing deterrence against Russian aggression after a period in which there were growing doubts about just how firmly committed the United States was to Ukraine. The decision to see Putin without a preparatory meeting with Zelenskyy, even a brief flyby, on top of the Nord Stream 2 decision, and then the whole debacle in Afghanistan raised legitimate doubts about whether the US was a reliable protector of Ukraine. I think the Ukrainians were looking for even more concrete manifestations of that support than they actually got. They got more defense assistance, but they didn't get much of a shift in the US position on NATO, or it's a little unclear whether the US is ready to get more involved in Donbass diplomacy. But overall, the visit was a success, and there were certainly a wide range of very impressive deliverables in that joint statement. A lot of things to work with that can benefit Ukraine if they carry through on their commitment to reform.
Thanks a lot, Sandy. Let me ask you a follow-up question. You sort of hinted at this. You and I had a debate last week. So Kiev has been vocal that it thinks President Biden and his team haven't really focused enough on them. And they point to the fact that you just mentioned that Biden met Putin before he met Zelenskyy. However, there were 2 presidential phone calls. Blinken visited Kiev, and so did another cabinet member very recently. Where do you come down on this question? Do you think the Biden team has given Kiev sufficient attention, even given the hubbub with Trump?
Well, of course, on the one hand, foreign leaders are never satisfied with the amount of attention they get, and the President of the United States is a very busy person, so they'll never be fully satisfied. But I think there were some genuine reasons for the Ukrainians to feel slighted in the early months of the administration. And as I already mentioned, the lack of prior consultation on the meeting with Putin or on the Nord Stream 2 decision. Classic violation of the principle, nothing about us without us. On the other hand, the Biden administration did respond very quickly and firmly to the Russian military buildup in the spring. So I think there definitely has been some attention, but I think this visit was very important in overcoming some of the doubts that had arisen, and to give the Ukrainians a sense that the U.S. still does treat them as an important partner and as a strategically important country when one looks at the long-term prospects for stability and democracy in Central and Eastern Europe.
Thank you so much. And let's go back to Ukraine for just a second. I know you're not sitting in Kiev, you're sitting in Odessa, but what's the overall perception in Kiev? You mentioned a little bit of the domestic picture. Can you say a little bit more about that? I know that there was a split in some opinions. Some opinion thought that he hit a home run, that he got an A+ or a 5, and then some people were a little bit more mixed. Can you explain the differences of opinion in Ukraine, please?
Yes, definitely. The public opinion really divided a little bit about this visit. In one, they're talking in unison. That is that the fact of the visit is very important, and it is a very good symbol about the relations between the United States and Ukraine. Even President Poroshenko stated it in his tweet, it seems to me, on Facebook, in some of the social networks. He said that it is a big plus and he congratulates the president with the visit. The question is how are the consequences or the results of the visit being evaluated. So definitely those who are followers of the president or of his party, they've been talking about the huge success in everything. from meeting of the presidents to final declaration to the meeting with the members of the Congress, travel to California, all of these being presented as in super something that never happened in the relations. So a little bit exaggeration because of the substance what being over there. At the same time, you also can find those who are in the strong opposition to the president that definitely they've been even undermining some of the decisions made, because they've been talking, okay, the fact of the visit is wonderful, but what really you reached? Some of the agreements being prepared even during the times of the previous president, something is just a little bit more money to what we already had. So what is the real substance in the agreements that you signed? Because they analyzed like security agreement and said, de facto, you agreed to negotiate rather than to something saying, like you agreed that this commission will meet, this format will meet, but it is not the real facts, not something that is changing bilateral relations. The real truth is definitely something in the mid. And you can see that there are not so many, because of the domestic political discourse, there are not so many experts or politicians who took the visit sober and try to analyze what are the benefits, what are the advantages from it, what are the real results, and what are definitely more of the diplomatic protocol wording rather than the sufficient substance to speak about the enhanced relations or the increased cooperation between the countries.
Thanks a lot, Hannah. That was really helpful. Ambassador Herbst, can you walk us through the joint declaration? I think it's a pretty robust document that the White House put out right after the visit. Can you walk us through and tell us the highlights of the joint declaration, please?
I think the main things about the joint declaration are one, again, to develop this, to revitalize, renew this security agreement that was first done about 14 years ago. That to me is key, but also talking about a new energy agreement, also very important. The joint statement, to my surprise, my pleasant surprise, features a sharp criticism from both parties on Nord Stream 2, so that's important. And the joint statement was just full of affirmations of the importance of this relationship. But again, while this thing was to my mind a great positive and a bit surprising, we had some indication it was coming, but not to full extent. The proof of the eating is in the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And so now we're gonna have to see the two sides negotiate this strategic doctrine. Once they negotiate the strategic doctrine, they need to then decide what precisely in the defense area we will do together. They need also then to negotiate the economic agreement. So a great deal remains to be done going forward. But the joint statement provides many great room for developing the bilateral relationship.
Thank you. Thanks so much, John. I think you're the only person on this call who met with President Zelenskyy several times during his meetings here. And you said that you thought it was a great success. Any other observations you want to share from your interactions with him?
Well, it's clear that he was delighted to be in the United States. I hosted his meeting with some think tankers and others at Mount Vernon, which I think was a wonderful venue for that event. And he was clearly upbeat to be there. He enjoyed that. Perhaps more important, though, was the meeting I attended as a silent participant with congressional members. It was organized by the indomitable Marcy Kaptur, the head of the Ukrainian caucus, and she was able to pull in 8 members, which was actually quite an achievement because, as we all know, Congress was not in session, which may have had something to do with the date of the visit because of the Nord Stream 2 differences. And that meeting was extremely friendly. The Congress folk, I think there were 6 Democrats and 2 Republicans, all spoke in great support for Ukraine, the desire to see the United States help Ukraine fight off Kremlin aggression, and also, not to be forgotten, to reform its economy. The reform side, of course, received less attention in this visit than the security side.
Thanks a lot. Sandy or Hannah, would either of you like to comment on some of the domestic pledges that were made in the joint declaration? There was a pledge on the SAPO prosecutor, and then also a pledge to finish SBU reform. Any comments or observations on the domestic pledges that were made in that declaration?
Very briefly from my side is just that is the topic very important for the NATO cooperation of Ukraine as well. And it seems to me that the United States just decided to include it in such a public document to attract additional attention. So definitely we know that both for the anti-corruption agencies as well as the issues of the security services reform, it is something on the agenda, not only of bilateral relations, but also of our relations with NATO for quite a long time. And these two reforms been slowing down recently. So it seems to me it's not even domestic pledges, it's more like the additional stick from the United States, like to pay attention, not to be able to hide it, and to demonstrate that these topics being not less important for Washington than the military or defense cooperation on which Ukrainian side predominantly emphasize.
Yeah, I agree with that. Putting it into the joint statement is a way of holding the Ukrainians' feet to the fire on these issues, although that's been tried many times in the past and doesn't always work. They're good at getting their feet out of the fire just in the nick of time. But I think it's also an unsubtle way of reminding the Ukrainians that a lot of the things that are in the joint statement in terms of additional credits for green energy projects or this research and defense technology agreement, none of these things are going to be actually successful for Ukraine unless they actually do the job on reform that they've been vacillating on, including under Zelenskyy with one step forward, two steps back on a number of issues. So if Ukraine wants to actually get something out of these deliverables, they have to create a much better investment climate, which means the rule of law, which means effective anti-corruption institutions. It means carrying through on the defense reforms that they've been working on for years now as part of the NATO annual national program, but there too, they haven't fully delivered. So whether this will be any more successful than in the past, we don't know, but I think it was a clever way of approaching these issues by the Biden administration.
Great, thanks a lot, Sandy. One more follow-up for you, Sandy. We have been looking at this. Washington gave an additional $60 million. This is in addition to the normal funding it gives to help Ukraine fight the Russians. Is this enough? What does this signify? And if you don't think it's enough, what would have been a sufficient figure?
Well, I don't think it was enough. Not that $60 million is something to sneeze at, and you put it all together with previous aid, and they're getting over $400 million during this year. So it's pretty good. But I think that the circumstances have significantly changed in the course of the last few months. The Russian buildup, while proved to be more of an intimidation tactic than the preparation for an actual invasion, is still a present threat, present danger. You've had the signals to Moscow that may be interpreted as a kind of a flashing green light to ratchet up the pressure, namely the Nord Stream 2 decision. And we've discussed not consulting with Ukraine before the Biden-Putin meeting. So I think there's a lot of reasons. I would add the increasing provocative behavior on the Black Sea and in the Sea of Azov that would have argued for a stronger military plus-up for Ukraine. More javelins are good, but I think air defense, drones, coastal defenses, anti-ship cruise missiles, a lot of things that would have been good for deterring new Russian provocations. And I think it would have also been good if there had been a more explicit spelling out of other consequences, including additional sanctions that Russia may face if it actually tries another land grab or seizes the North Crimean water canal or something else. But the Russian drumbeat of pressure, starting with Putin's little history lesson, new accusations of ecocide in the Crimea, and accusations of terrorist operations by Ukraine against a gas pipeline in Crimea last month. All of these are laying the basis for new Russian aggression, and more deterrent signaling, I think, would have been important, particularly when the signals on NATO were extremely cautious on the U.S. side.
Thanks, Sandy. That's where I want to go next. That's exactly where I want to go next. Okay, let's go to John. President Zelenskyy has made a case for NATO entry, and his administration has been pushing on this issue all year. Michael McFaul in the Washington Post last week recommends that Zelenskyy drop the appeal and do the hard work of reform before asking. What's your view, given the political realities in Washington and the Biden administration's focus on China, climate, and COVID? How can Kiev get what it wants, and what would you counsel them to do?
I don't think that there's any question. Ukraine will not be able to join NATO, say, in the next 10 years, or certainly the next 5 years, principally because there is substantial opposition within the alliance. Essentially, people are afraid of annoying the Russians. I think the reasoning is dreadful, but that's a political reality. McFaul is right that Ukraine could expedite eventual membership, and the fact that I think NATO is not prepared to accept Ukraine in the next decade does not mean NATO is never prepared to accept Ukraine. Ukraine can get itself ready by doing all the things that NATO requires future members to do. And those things also have the advantage of making Ukraine military interoperable with NATO before NATO is willing to accept membership. And also the reforms required would strengthen the country overall. So McFaul's advice is good. But of course, Mike does not take into account Ukrainian politics. And in the Ukrainian setting, I can understand why Zelenskyy wants to talk about this. I don't see a problem with him raising it, even if it's not going to be achieved. But the most important thing is, again, to make Ukraine ready for eventual membership, and to ensure that not just the United States, but other NATO members are willing to take incremental steps before that to enhance Ukraine's security. And I believe that an intelligent policy in Kyiv and in Washington can achieve those results in the short term.
Super, thank you, Ambassador Herbst. Ambassador Vershbow or Hannah, any differences of opinion on that?
I basically agree with that. And what Mike McFaul is recommending is kind of the posture that the U.S. has been taking for several years. You know, do your homework and don't push right now on membership action plan or any other specific steps that would actually transform the 2008 promise into reality. But I think that I understand why the Ukrainians aren't satisfied with that, as John just said. And I don't think if I were in their shoes, I would let the U.S. completely off the hook. My sense is the Biden administration is hiding behind the hesitation of other allies and is not prepared to take even baby steps that would at least begin to prepare the ground, which may still be 4, 5, 6 years in the future, for actually extending an Article 5 guarantee to Ukraine, which is what we're talking about here. And I think the Biden administration could get other allies much more involved in military assistance to Ukraine. If they don't want to talk about membership, well, let's talk about strengthening Ukraine's self-defense capability. They could consider expanding the numbers of exercises that take place on Ukrainian territory, establish a joint training center like we've done in Georgia, so that there's actually more NATO visible presence in Ukraine without creating any illusions that this is not the same thing as membership. In other words, put a little more skin in the game of building deterrence, and over time, start the work inside the alliance that would actually begin to make a reality of this. NATO is trying to decide what it's going to be like in the year 2030. That's already 9 years away. I think the future of the open door and Ukraine's prospects should be at least debated inside NATO as part of this NATO 2030 process, and not just keep kicking the can down the road.
Thanks a lot.
I would add very briefly just that you need also to understand the domestic context and in the Ukrainian context, how it is perceived, each of these statements. That is quite a serious issue because when you just said that Ukraine would not become a member in 10 years, that is one thing, that is understandable. But in Ukraine, a lot of experts and politicians always raise the question, okay, that is about membership. Here we understand. What prevents you from giving the membership action plan? That is not about Article 5, because everybody who is afraid of Russia, they're afraid of Article 5 implication for Ukraine. So what is the problem with membership action plan? The problem is definitely psychological effect of the phrases like these, because it's not only Macron. We unfortunately hear from both European and American politicians from time to time that it's just reforms, and any promises from the side of the NATO member states. So some people in Ukraine started to say, okay, let's do reforms and don't care about NATO. So because of this, we are just coming to the situation when NATO is decreasing support, and the probably some kind of attraction among the population, who especially doesn't understand all this big politics, why it is happening inside of the NATO. So these phrases very often are having very negative effects, not at the process of reforms of Ukraine, but to the image of NATO. And because these discussions sometimes is also happening now within the last weeks, of those of you who know, tomorrow the Verkhovna Rada, the Parliament of Ukraine, will vote for the statement asking the United States to provide it the status of the main non-NATO ally. And because of this decision, a lot of the politicians, diplomats, experts are debating now, should Ukraine ask for this status? Like, everybody understands the benefits, the practical benefits that Ukraine can have, but the debate is exactly within the NATO context. Will the status given to Ukraine provide to NATO member states additional reasons not to speak about the membership action plan, for example, or about the future membership of Ukraine in NATO? And such debate is quite a dangerous trend, I would say, because they're immediately used and manipulated by the pro-Russian proxies.
Thanks a lot. Let me ask you guys a follow-up question. This is for all three of you. This is from Roman at FT. He says Ukraine's parliament may adopt the what you just mentioned, Ukraine's NNA status, but the Zelenskyy administration is against this. Ambassador Oksana Markarova just posted a Facebook post explaining that Ukraine's aim is to join NATO, and that it currently has, through NATO and the US security framework in place, which make MNNA not optimal. Is there a logic here, given Ukraine's chance of getting into NATO anytime soon is distant? But what do you guys think? Hannah, do you want to go first?
Yeah, that's exactly what I stated. That the question is that my colleague at Ukrainian Prism just published his report analyzing what does it mean to be MNNA and what it can give to Ukraine. And the issue is that a lot of those who are against, they're just demonstrating that, look, the latest agreements, bilateral agreements between Ukraine and the United States, already providing conditions for implementing many of the norms that can be added to MNNA. Plus, the enhanced opportunity partnership status that Ukraine just had last year can benefit with the additional clauses, because they are very like exchange of the intelligence information, for example. It can be done through this EOP status. You don't need it. The biggest fear is definitely that providing of this status will distract attention from the Ukrainian efforts to receive the membership action plan and the future membership. And the fear that it would be used both inside of the country, but also by some of our partner countries within NATO, because we also understand that unfortunately there are some who are looking for the excuses, additional excuses, and it is the fear that receiving M&A, they can say, okay, you already have the very strong cooperation, so maybe we need to postpone and not to discuss this issue immediately.
Thanks a lot, Hannah. Okay, let's move on to the Donbass. I've got a couple of questions on that. Volodymyr wants to know, is there a place for a specific role for the US on the Donbass? What is the best format of engagement and leverage? It looks like Volodymyr Zelenskyy asked Biden to get in and to recharge the Normandy talks, and it looks like the US has rejected that. So where are we? Let's go with John first and then Sandy.
I think it's pretty clear. On the one hand, I think that the Biden administration, as we've seen, shows undue deference to the opinion of Germany and maybe also of France in this. And I don't think the French or the Germans are really interested in the US joining. Of course, the Russians, I'm not sure, are interested. But I think it's also true that the Minsk process has been, with one important exception, a huge failure. It's achieved nothing in actually advancing negotiations to get the Kremlin out. to get the Kremlin out of Donbass. The one thing it has done, which is good, is provided the basis for the European Union to impose sanctions on Moscow for its aggression in Ukraine, and that's useful. If you look at the history of negotiations on Donbass since 2014, the only venue which has provided interesting exchange was between Moscow and Washington for roughly 6 months when Toria Nuland was an assistant secretary under Obama, and then again for roughly 6 months when Kurt Volker was a special envoy for Donbass negotiations under Trump. When Moscow decides that it's not going to win in Donbass, and it's not going to win in Donbass, it will be ready to do real negotiations. We haven't seen that point reached yet.
Great. Let me ask one follow-up question. Go ahead, Sandy.
I agree with John, although for me, it's not entirely clear that Biden rejected the invitation. I think that they're kind of keeping their options open. Foreign Minister Kuleba is talking today about how the Foreign Ministry is studying lots of options for how to engage the U.S. in the talks based on Biden's signals. So it's a little confused. But I think the U.S. definitely doesn't want to invest much political capital in this effort if it's not going to produce any results. And in that sense, the Russians don't seem to be at all serious. They haven't been serious for 7 years. They may be getting less serious, for example, in blocking the renewal of the mandate for the OSCE monitors, ratcheting up the bogus arguments that Russia is not a party to the conflict or a party to the Minsk agreements, which you just have to read the documents and you see the signature of Vladimir Putin. The Biden administration also is still struggling to get itself organized in personnel terms. There's no Assistant Secretary of State for Europe who might become the point person for this issue if prospects improve. But I agree with John that there's only been progress when the U.S. has been involved. And I think if there's any chance at all of a settlement that could genuinely preserve Ukrainian sovereignty, it will require heavy lifting from the United States, and they'll have to not push them aside, but ensure that Berlin and Paris don't obstruct or play an unhelpful role when the U.S. decides to throw its weight into the process.
Great, thank you so much. We have a lot of questions, and I'm going to ask our panelists to give us nice, short, and sweet answers. First question for Ambassador Herbst is from Anatoly Gritsenko. Hello, Anatoly. There is no Minsk mentioned in the joint declaration. Do you, sir, see any meeting or intention behind this fact?
Anatoly, it's great to have you a part of this. I think that we partly covered this already. Sandy's right that Biden does not seem to be keen on getting involved in this. I've provided some of the reasons for that. And again, when it comes time for a real negotiation, I don't have any doubt the United States will be there as a principal or the principal negotiator, along with Ukraine and Russia. So again, Minsk has not been a success for the reasons I've described, but also it has been useful as a reason for sanctions, and that's important, keeping the pressure on the Kremlin.
Yeah. I think what the joint statement was significant about it didn't say Minsk is the basis for an agreement, which is a shift, if it wasn't just an accident, in the sense that it could increase the leverage or the pressure for Russia to agree to at least some modifications of Minsk, which lacks lots of implementation details. And of course, its interpretation in the form of things like the Steinmeier formula is very one-sided in Russia's favor. So some modifications or elaboration of Minsk is going to be needed if there's ever going to be an agreement. So in that sense, the joint statement, I think, is helpful in avoiding that traditional mantra that a settlement must be literally based on Minsk.
That's a great point, Sandy. Anatoly has another follow-up for you guys. He says, given the deterrent signals that you've mentioned, are those signals strong enough to prevent a large-scale offensive against Ukraine by Putin? Do the speakers rule out such a possibility of a Russian offensive in the near future in a year or 2 years time period? Hannah, I'm going to let you have that one first.
The 7 years, if not the 300 years of Ukrainian-Russian history demonstrated that nothing can be a guarantee and nothing can dismiss the concerns. Sometimes you think that you're in the most peaceful time, as it used to be with the Tuzla incident in 2003, or even with the Crimean annexation when nobody expected. That's why definitely just the joint declaration of two presidents, it's not that signal that would stop Russia. Maybe something being negotiated in Geneva back a few months ago, but at the same time, the real security situation that we see, the tactic that now Russia is using in Crimea after the Crimea Platform Summit just 2 weeks ago is definitely demonstrating that Russia will poke the bear. This time it is American grizzly, not the Russian bear, but it will be the poking till that moment when they really feel they can do it. And it seems to me that as for now, they're feeling that they still can do it without serious harm.
Thanks, Hannah. Sandy, this is a good question for you from Jacob Halbrun at the National Interest. He says, doesn't the bumpy pullout from Afghanistan actually increase the pressure on Biden to demonstrate his fidelity to NATO and by implication, Ukraine?
Well, I think it does increase the pressure to show fidelity to NATO. Whether that extends fully to Ukraine as well is less clear, because there's no treaty obligation to Ukraine in the way that there is to the other members of NATO. So I would hope that after this meeting and sort of the recommitment to Ukraine's security, that we will see a sustained effort to help the Ukrainians strengthen their deterrence. And I think that there are reasons to be dissatisfied with just how effective that deterrence is today. Yes, the Russians, I don't think, are interested in occupying large amounts of additional territory, which would be quite all-consuming. It would certainly lead to major new sanctions. But a more limited land grab in Crimea because of the water situation, or some kind of escalation in the occupied parts of Donbass to kind of cement the division or even annex those territories with a military operation can't be ruled out. And I think we need to think of other things beyond the package that was agreed during this summit that can ensure the Russians are in no doubt that they will pay a heavy price if they try any of these even more limited attack scenarios. And that's what I hope will be the focus under this new strategic defense framework.
Thanks, Sandy. Ambassador Herbst, Brendan wants to know if you could tell us which congressional representatives attended the Friends of Ukraine meeting. And I think you're muted, sir.
Yeah, no, I'm unmuted now. I don't know if that, actually, I guess that was meant to be, not meant to be simply private. I mean, again, it was Congresswoman Captor was the host for it. You also had Congressman Brad Sherman of Los Angeles. You had the Ukrainian American Congresswoman from Indiana. You had a Democratic Congressman from Colorado, but I don't remember the names. But again, there were 4 others.
Okay, great, thank you. Good question from Anders Oslin. He says, well, the meeting appeared successful in security, the most important part, and energy. It was striking that economic reforms were just about absent in the official statements. Do you think that the Biden administration has given up on economic reform under Zelenskyy and is just focused on security now, or was it just being nice in terms of diplomatic relations? John, you want the first crack at that one?
Well, as we already discussed, the statement did refer to at least some reform legislation, so it wasn't completely absent. But I think Anders is right that, relatively speaking, reform received less attention than security, and I think the circumstances of the summit explain that. Again, the years of confusion going back to Trump's manipulations of the Afghan debacle and the Nord Stream 2 problem. I think the Biden administration wanted a smooth summit, and I think so did Zelenskyy. So the more difficult issues did not receive quite as much attention as perhaps they should have.
Ambassador Herbst, we've talked about the reform issue and that it was not a big focus. Do you know how much Nord Stream 2 was discussed behind closed doors?
Well, Zelenskyy said during the meeting with congressional representatives that Biden had agreed that if Nord Stream 2, if the Russians violate the understanding of the joint statement between the US and Germany on Nord Stream 2, that there would be sanctions. And he said it flatly. So I took that as a partial reassurance coming from the president, from our president to President Zelenskyy. But having said that, I don't want to be Pollyannish. I mean, we've seen a number of clear Kremlin provocations in the gas sector since Biden lifted the sanctions. They're slowing down of gas supplies to Europe being most prominent, but also Putin's history essay, a provocation. And none of those things have produced a response from either Washington or Berlin. And I think it's going to be important for people on the outside, people in Ukraine, to point this out to the administration, and also to point this out to Chancellor Merkel, that the Russians are already playing games once they decided that they had bamboozled Washington and Berlin on Nord Stream 2.
Okay, thanks a lot. Hannah, we have two questions about Crimea. The questions are basically, what was the position on Crimea in this statement, and was there a commitment, any commitment from the U.S. to resolve the status of Crimea?
Definitely, the declaration is just confirming the previous statements by the United States that they are completely confirming the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And much more about the U.S. involvement been telling the presence at the Crimea summit platform back on the 23rd of August. And let's to be honest, quite an interesting last-minute change. Definitely from the very beginning in Ukrainian media, people have been discussing why it is DTG, why it is Ministry of Transport. And it took quite a time of explaining that even the transport has nothing with the foreign policy and with the Ukraine, but what meaning this posture this individual has within the US politics. Still, let's be honest that it was not that easy accepted within Ukraine. Ukraine expected a little bit higher higher position, probably, or somebody closer to Ukrainian topic being present. And when at the last moment it's been changed to energy, it's been also accepted a little bit suspicious. That a lot of media started to publish articles saying something like the United States is interested not in security, not in Crimea, but just in the Nord Stream and in energy relations with Ukraine. So it is very important to understand that not always the US context is understood in Ukraine and how all these signals can be misread within the Ukrainian political discourse. At the same time, definitely the presence of the United States and signing of the declaration, which is just quite a serious document, even that it is just the declaration, but at the same time, it is certain commitments that the countries are ready to take. They've been quite a good signal. Now it seems to me that it should be the next step, and that is what is expected in Ukraine, to see a little bit greater involvement of the United States. If it is more or less started to be understandable why the United States would not involve deeper in Donbass, including Normandy, including all other issues that we've already discussed. So Crimea was seen by many that it is the chance for the United States to be more involved, to express their position more vivid, especially after Pompeo declaration a few years back, and especially with those human rights violations that are happening within the last weeks. So that is something that is still looks very weak. It seems to me, I mean, probably weak is not the best word, but not sufficient. That would be better word. When the more vocal position of the United States should be reminded, because I understand that everything written in Pompeo declaration, but 3 years for the current media world, it is always a very historical document. So now it was really a good time to renew, to get more attention to these, and looks like Crimea being just one of the topics, the same as Donbass or any other security concerns, but it didn't get that much attention that maybe somebody did expect.
Great, thanks, Hannah. Okay, we have 15 minutes. I got a bunch of questions. You get 2 sentences, and if you can answer it in yes or no, you get a brownie or a sticker. Here we go. If you could unmute all 3 of you guys, that'd be great. First question, we talked a lot about the Normandy format, and I'd like a yes or no to this. Do we expect the Biden administration to jump into the Normandy format in the next year or two? What do you think, Sandy?
The next year or two, probably not. I think some other way of engagement is more likely.
Okay,
Maybe
super.
bilateral with Russia in parallel to existing efforts.
Any disagreement, John or Hannah?
I agree with Sandy. He's got it right.
Okay, super. This is an easy one too. Was there any discussion of the 3 C's initiative? I think that's a John question.
I think it did come up, but I'm not sure it received much attention.
Okay, sounds good. This one's for Sandy. The Russian Federation is going to be holding parliamentary elections very soon, and the elections will be held illegally in the Ukrainian occupied territories. Did the 2 presidents discuss this? Will the elections be recognized, and will there be more sanctions? You get more than 2 sentences for that one, Sandy.
Yeah, I honestly don't know if it was discussed, but it is a serious issue as part of the kind of creeping annexation of the occupied territories. The Russians have definitely registered all these people with their brand new shiny Russian passports to vote in the Duma election. It'll be part of the way to pad Putin's majority, along with other forms of falsification and vote rigging.
Wonderful, thank you. Hannah, Robert Homans wants to talk about Ukrainians' expectations for the new Verkhovna Rada session, which opens today. One of the bills that's coming up is de-oligarchization. Is there any chance that that bill is going to pass?
It's always the chance. The question is that definitely this legislation is very controversial, and not even within the presidential party all members of parliament support it. So it will be quite difficult to find the exact number necessary for adoption. And the question will be what is more important, just to show up with this legislation that we tried, and then to blame Verkhovna Rada that they couldn't adopt it, or really to push it. And we understand that one of the top targets aim of this law, it is former President Poroshenko. So that will be definitely, when we see the voting, it will be not just about this law, but definitely demonstration what was more important for the office of the president, the show up or the fight against our former president.
Great point, thank you. Ambassador Herbst, is Ukraine a priority in the Biden administration? If yes, who is the point person? If no, how can it be made a greater priority?
I think it sort of falls in between priority and non-priority. I believe the administration understands that there's a commitment to Ukraine, even if we don't have an Article 5 commitment, that it would be disastrous to walk away from, especially after Afghanistan. At the same time, they haven't made the intellectual commitment to actually pursue the close relationship, which I think is warranted. But if there is someone who will drive this, I suspect it will wind up being Under Secretary Nuland. But we haven't seen the decision yet.
Okay, thank you. Ambassador Vershba, this is a different one for you. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say I agree with that. I think the danger that, in my mind, is that the Biden administration, because of its focus on China, may be satisfied by kind of defusing the Russia-Ukraine conflict rather than solving it. No, that may be an improvement over where we are now, but it also would kind of codify de facto Russian ill-gotten gains and redivision of Europe as part of their effort to restore the empire. So a danger I see is the Biden administration pushing the Europeans to be more assertive on China and just parking the Ukraine-Russia issue, which I think is, in the long run, not really possible and could lead to a worse situation than we have now.
Thank you. One question for you, different subject, Sandy. Ukraine is undertaking a massive digital transformation of its economy, and it's quite impressive. And this includes expanding its broadband internet infrastructure. Will these modifications make Ukraine's security more susceptible to Russian aggression?
Well, it depends how it's done, obviously, and whether technologies are shared with Ukraine that enable them to have resilient infrastructure that's less susceptible to either Russian or Chinese interference when it comes to 5G networks or other technologies. So the devil's in the details.
Okay, great. Hannah, question for you about Zapad 2021. Are there any predictions or real concerns regarding these joint military exercises of Russian and Belarusian armed forces in terms of security in the region and potential implications for Ukraine?
It is always concern about any military exercises on the borders of your country, because many of the previous interventions to Georgia, to Ukraine happen exactly within the period of exercises. But for us, what is more important when you are paying attention only to Zapad, what is to the north of Ukraine, we are also paying attention to the south, because at the same time, the Russian Federation is announcing so-called exercises within the Black Sea and Azov Sea, closing some of the zones as for the exercises and pretending of the serious movements of the forces on the south. So for us, we always need to pay attention in both directions, to the north and to the south. That distracts a lot of energy and attention, that doesn't allow to concentrate. And that is exactly what Russia aims to. So definitely, when you speak just about Zapad, we are paying attention not only to the implication to us, but unfortunately, the events of the latest months around Belarus, that is also very important. So those forces that are coming to Belarus, will they stay there or will they leave? Will it be any provocations against Lithuania, Poland, or Ukraine? So all these issues are definitely becoming burning and topical for the weeks of the exercises.
Sandy or John, any other predictions or thoughts on Zapad?
Again, we're all watching to see not only what kinds of new offensive capabilities the Russians demonstrate, but how much of a residual militarization of Belarus will be left even after the exercise is over. Already looks like Lukashenko, increasingly isolated internationally, is handing over the keys to a lot of things in Belarus to Russia, and that could have long-term military and strategic consequences for NATO and obviously for Ukraine as the vulnerable neighbor.
Thanks a lot. Okay, we have several minutes remaining. If you haven't got your question in, please go ahead and type it either into the Zoom chat or send it to us on Twitter, and the staff will send it on over. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have a few more questions. This one is for Hannah. Hannah, do you think that Zelensky's DC visit will have a positive impact on his government's efforts to actually to implement judicial reform and rein in the oligarchs? Do you think that the perception in Kiev is that the U.S. is paying attention and will be monitoring this, or what's the perception?
Definitely, it is the perception of Ukraine. The United States is following any kind of reforms happening in Ukraine, especially important reforms like judicial, anti-corruption, and the corporate governance. But at the same time, I would not connect the US visit with the voting that we're expecting and those reforms that should happen. So somehow they're happening in parallel. So it is more of the general view that not only the United States, but I would say G7 in general, they are very carefully following 5 or 6 big reforms that are necessary for Ukraine, and that each time we see their reaction and their commands when something is happening around these reforms.
Great, thank you. Ambassador Herbst, what's next for US-Ukrainian relations? You mentioned a bunch of steps. You've also mentioned the Strategic Partnership Commission and also the Energy Commission. And we also know that US Secretary of Defense is likely going to visit Kiev. We also know that President Zelenskyy is coming back over for UNGA. But what's next in the next, between now and Christmas time?
Well, again, the most important thing is putting some flesh on the bones of this Strategic Commission and the energy agreement. If, in fact, the two sides can work out a suitable agenda and reach agreement, that will be huge. Again, the Zelenskyy visit was important for a general statement of support from the United States, but making that support concrete is going to be important as a deterrence to Moscow and as a reassurance for Ukraine. And I know that the Ukrainians are eager to do this. We'll see if the United States is equally eager.
Great, thank you. Let me ask the three of you a final closing question. We know that this White House is very focused on other priorities. You can analyze the national security documents and you find out that China is mentioned 15 times, Russia is mentioned 5, Ukraine is mentioned 0. What advice would you have for the Ukrainian government as it interfaces with the Biden administration on how to make Ukraine a greater priority? What argument would you be using? Is the humanitarian argument going to work? Is the argument that Ukraine is important because Putin could escalate in other places? What argument do you think works for this realist crowd? Sandy, do you want to take a crack at that one first?
Sure. Well, I think the Biden administration, needs to be reminded this is a critical test of its democracy agenda. which has been highlighted as sort of the guiding principle, guiding value for Biden's whole foreign policy. And if Ukraine's democracy is ultimately undermined by Russia, that's a very bad omen for what could happen in other parts of not only the former Soviet Union, but in Central Europe. And then there's the strategic issue. If we're going to have a stable Europe going forward, particularly after the doubts about U.S. staying power in the wake of Afghanistan, Ukraine is a crucial test, and we cannot flunk that test. So fighting for Ukraine's freedom is about Ukrainians, and they deserved our help, but it's also about the future of the whole European security system, the international rules-based order, whatever you want to call it.
Super. John, Hannah?
If I could jump in on that. I agree with Sandy's points, but I would add two more. One, there's this notion, which some people in the administration seem to have, that we need Russia against China, and that the way to get Russia against China is to let Russia behave like a thug in Ukraine and elsewhere. And that is simply bad reasoning. If that would be like saying we had to let Mussolini take Addis Ababa in Ethiopia to hive him off from Hitler. It didn't work in the 30s. It's not going to work now. What we need to do is demonstrate to Russia and to China that aggression has unfortunate consequences, negative consequences. Eventually, China and Russia will split, but not by us appeasing Russia. That to me is the most important point.
Any other arguments if you were to get in front of the White House?
Yeah, very briefly, it seems to me that one of the biggest problems of Ukraine that we concentrated US-Ukraine relations predominantly on the Russian threat. Russian threat is extremely important, but for 7 years we have these arguments, and that is already bringing certain difficulties in our relations. Because the United States doesn't see the benefits for themselves. They doesn't see what is the future. So the best arguments from the Ukrainian side would be definitely to find how to explain to the United States why it is beneficial for them. That Russia and intervention in Ukraine is not only about Ukraine and Russia. The United States already witnessed all the problems with interference in the relations and all other stuff. Alaska can be the next. It's not to be alarming, but just to demonstrate that the lessons learned from Ukraine can be in other regions as well. And it can one day be not only interference into elections, but it can be any other threat. But also to find the positive agenda for two countries. Because it seems to me now what Sandy told about democracy, after Afghanistan, democracy is a positive agenda, and the United States also needs the good examples. So supporting Ukraine, paying more attention to Ukraine, it's also the possibility of looking for the positive agenda in terms of democracy, in terms of reform, but also in terms of the cooperation like space industry. That's one of the agreements that been signed during the Zelenskyy visit. So to show these success stories of bilateral relations, that would be not just about Ukraine and Russia. That would not be just about the issues of the conflict. And it seems to me that that's something that can be catchy for the White House or for the State Department, because they are also desperately in need of the good stories after the last year events.
Super. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you to our audience for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure to be here with you. Please keep your eye on our emails. Please come back. We have some exciting fall programming lined up, and we can't wait to be with you once again. Thank you and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.